más sistemática y menos subalterna del empirismo, de una especie de énfasis en un positivismo experimentalista, y después en la introducción de consideraciones éticas en la investigación de laboratorio con seres humanos, en la que era práctica habitual en psicología social engañar a los sujetos experimentales y o someterles a situaciones penosas de ansiedad y estrés. Imagino que todos ustedes deben tener noticia de los conocidos experimentos de Milgram o, en el caso de Zimbardo y otros. Pues bien, en cierto modo, por la sensibilidad ética del profesor Kelman, todo eso fue reconsiderado y la APA, en fin, comenzó a preocuparse de las implicaciones que tenía la manipulación de personas en los laboratorios, en fin, para la investigación. No todos los fines justifican los medios. Fue esa sensibilidad ética y epistemológica lo que le llevó a avizorar desde muy temprano, en sintonía con el último Gordon Allport, cosa que no es muy sabida, el ritualismo experimentalista y el individualismo psicologista por el que se encarrilaba la psicología social convencional y que desencadenaron la así llamada crisis de la psicología social. Sería interesante, y esto también se lo digo a él, contrastar lo que el profesor Kelman decía a finales de los años 60 con lo que algunos de sus colegas más ortodoxos decían en el año 2000. Colegas más ortodoxos como Sions, como French, etc. Ese contraste revelaría que él avizoró adecuadamente el curso de lo que iba a acontecer, por lo menos de lo que debía haber sido. Ha sido también esa sensibilidad lo que le ha llevado a pensar y a hacer una psicología social como ciencia social, realmente como ciencia social, es decir, como un saber necesariamente interdisciplinar, que no puede clausurarse en los límites conceptuales, administrativos o corporativos de la psicología. Él podría hablar ampliamente de ello porque fue nada menos que director de los programas doctorales en psicología social más importantes de Estados Unidos, el de la Universidad de Michigan y el de Harvard. Nos sería de mucha utilidad en esta universidad el tener en cuenta sus experiencias en ese sentido. En consonancia con esa concepción interdisciplinar y axiológicamente comprometida, ha desarrollado una suerte de psicosociología clínica, es decir, práctico-interventiva, es decir, un tipo de ciencia que no es simplemente mirar la realidad, sino mirarla en lo que esa realidad puede ofrecernos para su cambio hacia mejor, es decir, en unas posibilidades, o de reformarla, si evidentemente no nos satisface. En última instancia, toda ciencia tiene ese destino, que es la práctico-intervención, obviamente desde la teoría, ¿no? Por tanto, una especie de psicosociología clínica práctico-interventiva orientada al estudio y creación de las condiciones que hacen posible la resolución de conflictos y, en definitiva, la paz. Todo ello desde la convicción y la esperanza de que la psicología y las ciencias sociales, en general, tienen como misión promover el bienestar y el desarrollo humanos. El profesor Kelman, frente a lo que decía hace unas semanas en este mismo foro un tal señor Watson, divulgador científico y supuestamente historiador de las ideas, ha mostrado que las ciencias sociales pueden contribuir, y de hecho contribuyen, a la realización de esos valores que antes hemos señalado, incluso en conflictos tan enormemente complicados como el árabe-israelí, que lleva, como ustedes saben muy bien, más de medio siglo en fin, sin resolver. Es por eso por lo que los estudiosos y expertos internacionales en el mismo le consideran el néstor de la investigación-acción relacionada con Oriente Medio. Es decir, saben ustedes que Néstor era un rey en la leyenda griega, considerado como una especie de gran conocedor en fin, de las luchas y batallas, estuvo en el asedio a Troya. Por tanto, como el sabio pionero de cuyo saber y experiencia cabe extraer muchas enseñanzas. Es decir, que está considerado por quienes se dedican realmente a ese campo de la resolución del conflicto, pues en fin, un viejo pionero, es decir, incluso fundador de una diplomacia paralela en la resolución de ese tema. Así lo queremos, es decir, igualmente desde el ámbito académico de las ciencias sociales, y por ello nos congratulamos y le agradecemos que haya aceptado hablar una vez más en nuestra universidad, que también es la suya, puesto que es doctor honoris causa por la misma. Por tanto, yo, ciñéndome realmente a un tiempo límite, simplemente me queda de darle muchas gracias, maestro, por su presencia aquí.
Bien, a ver cómo funciona esto. ¿Funciona bien? Sí. Gracias, buenos días a todos. Ante todo, quisiera agradecer al Foro Complutense, al decanato de nuestra facultad y al profesor José R. Torregrosa la iniciativa relacionada con la invitación del profesor Kelman. Yo creo que en efecto, bueno, pues tenemos la fortuna, ¿no?, de volver a encontrarnos con el profesor Kelman y bueno, pues aprender, ¿no?, de su larga trayectoria académica e investigadora y también de intervención. A mí me corresponde la tarea, digamos, de presentar al profesor Kelman. Debo decir que no es una tarea fácil, porque justamente esta larga trayectoria no se presta, digamos, a un resumen muy abreviado de sus actividades. No obstante, quisiera recalcar algunos aspectos. En primer lugar, bueno, solamente debo señalar que el profesor Kelman nace en Viena a finales de la década de los años 20, vive una temporada corta en Amberes, en Bélgica, donde cursa su educación primaria y en 1940 llega a los Estados Unidos. En este país se va a graduar en Psicología en el Brooklyn College de Nueva York y va a proseguir sus estudios superiores doctorándose en Psicología Social y Personalidad en la Universidad de Harvard y también de Michigan, donde, bueno, pues, va a ampliar, ¿no?, sus conocimientos. Hay que decir que a esta trayectoria, ¿no?, se suman muchas actividades en calidad de profesor visitante de universidades estadounidenses, pero también de universidades europeas, Italia, Austria, ¿no? También va a establecer relaciones y vínculos con universidades de Israel, de Egipto y de otros países. A ello hay que añadir también una actividad especialmente notable con respecto a su implicación en distintas revistas científico-sociales. Ha sido y sigue siendo miembro de muchas organizaciones académico-profesionales y en ese sentido quisiera recalcar su papel activo tanto en la Asociación de Psicología Americana como en la Asociación Americana de Sociología. Estos aspectos son especialmente importantes porque ponen de relieve, ¿no?, su sensibilidad justamente por los aspectos sociales. Dicho de otra manera, se trata de considerar la psicología social como una ciencia social, fundamentalmente. En lo que se refiere a su larga trayectoria investigadora, no voy a dar unos detalles, ya que sus publicaciones reflejan, lógicamente, sus preocupaciones. Solamente debo decir que su primera publicación se remonta a 1945. En ella se puede vislumbrar muy claramente su interés por la cooperación entre israelíes y árabes. Dicho de otra manera, ya estamos ante, digamos, el inicio del conflicto israelí-palestino o palestino-israelí. Este interés por la cooperación, por la resolución de conflictos bélicos, se va a ampliar, ¿no?, en las décadas siguientes. También resulta especialmente interesante la atención que presta a movimientos como el pacifismo, poniendo además, haciendo hincapié, ¿no?, en el papel de la psicología, concretamente de la psicología social, más bien, en las actividades y acciones que giran en torno al pacifismo. Hay otro aspecto que resulta también obligatorio, ¿no?, subrayar. Es la conexión que existe entre, yo diría, sus actividades académicas e investigadoras en torno a algunos aspectos teórico-conceptuales, concretamente lo que son los procesos de influencia social y el cambio actitudinal, pero poniendo, digamos, estos aspectos que serían propiamente de investigación básica con otras perspectivas más propias de la psicología social aplicada y de la intervención social. Este aspecto creo que debemos subrayarlo, es especialmente sobresaliente. Ha también abordado cuestiones relacionadas con la opinión pública y las decisiones en materia, por ejemplo, de asuntos exteriores. Lógicamente, este punto no se puede, desligar de las problemáticas relacionadas con la resolución de conflictos bélicos. Lógicamente, ha invertido muchos esfuerzos en aproximarse al estudio y el análisis de los procesos relacionados con la guerra y la paz, y fundamentalmente con la prevención de los conflictos bélicos y armados. Otro tema que debemos también subrayar es el relacionado con los crímenes de obediencia. Hay que decir que sobre esta cuestión el profesor Kelman ha ofrecido una excelente publicación que fue traducida al español en Argentina, y no es por casualidad. Lógicamente, los argentinos, como muchísimos otros latinoamericanos, fueron implicados, ¿no?, tuvieron por lo menos un papel, de un modo u otro, en muchos procesos de conflictos políticos y internos, ¿no? Como contrapartida, ¿no?, es decir, con respecto a esta preocupación, ¿no?, por los crímenes de obediencia, el profesor Kelman se ha interesado también por las reacciones o por los movimientos o por los comportamientos políticos relacionados con la desobediencia civil. Seguramente lo que merece también ser señalado es que todos estos aspectos están o se enmarcan dentro de una perspectiva analítica centrada en los aspectos éticos de la investigación y concretamente la investigación en psicología social. Ya el profesor Torregrosa ha hecho referencia anteriormente a la ética y su papel en procedimientos, ¿no?, de investigación relacionados con la manipulación del comportamiento. Lógicamente habría que ampliar y extender, ¿no?, esta perspectiva ética a otras cuestiones relacionadas, como no, con los conflictos bélicos y con los procesos también de reconciliación. En estos últimos años, el profesor Kelman ha invertido muchos esfuerzos en la resolución de conflictos desde un punto de vista más propio justamente de la intervención social y de la psicología social aplicada. En ese sentido, debemos hacer hincapié, como no, en su papel en distintos comités, ¿no?, y distintos grupos que han priorizado la necesidad de resolver el conflicto palestino-israelí. Este aspecto, el de la reconciliación, está prácticamente, yo diría, vivo, ¿no?, en muchas latitudes, en muchos contextos, tanto en América Latina como en cierta medida también en América del Norte y concretamente en los Estados Unidos, con respecto a lo mejor a conflictos de otra naturaleza, como pueden ser los conflictos raciales, por ejemplo, pero está también presente en el continente asiático y en el continente europeo y africano. Son muchos los comités y las comisiones y organizaciones de países africanos, del Magreb, del Mashrek, de Asia, de América y concretamente de América Latina, que han desplegado muchos esfuerzos para poder llegar justamente a la reconciliación. Pero no cabe duda que la reconciliación no siempre termina con éxito. Yo solamente quisiera remitirme a un caso muy concreto que afecta a un país vecino, pero que es un país del sur, que es por ejemplo Marruecos. Y en este caso tenemos un ejemplo muy concreto que es l'instance équité y réconciliation, podríamos traducirlo por la instancia equidad y reconciliación, que no ha dado los frutos esperados por los opositores y por las víctimas que sufrieron los años de plomo. Es decir, las represiones tremendas, ¿no?, dictadas por el ex monarca marroquí, que era Hassan II. Este ejemplo lo podemos encontrar lógicamente en otras latitudes, pero ahora creo que no me corresponde ampliar, ¿no?, ciertas consideraciones sobre esta materia, sino ceder la palabra al profesor Kelman. Y solamente decirle que agradecemos su presencia y lógicamente estamos expectantes, ¿no?, con respecto a los contenidos de la charla que nos va a ofrecer. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
Well, let me. Can you hear me?
Okay.
First, I want to thank you for your generous introductions. This is the first time in my experience that I've been introduced by three. That I've been introduced three times. Each very important.
That means the wideness of your influence.
Thank you. I might mention, by the way, that I appreciated you mentioning Ignacio Martín Baró, who was one of my heroes. And I think he's established a tradition that I hope I fit into to some degree. It's a pleasure to be back at Universidad Complutense de Madrid. As you've heard, I'm entitled to say it's a pleasure to be back home because the university has given me the honor of including me in your scholarly community. So let me get to my topic. I don't know how much time I have, but
about 45 minutes, 1 hour.
All right, all right. If necessary, you could pull me off. My work for nearly 4 decades has been on the development and application of what I call interactive problem solving and excuse me, an unofficial scholar-practitioner approach to the resolution of protracted, deep-rooted, and often violent conflicts between identity groups, particularly, sorry, I guess it's hard for a throat to listen. Particularly ethno-national groups, an approach that is derived from the pioneering work of John Burton and anchored in social psychological principles. My primary focus over the years, as you've heard, has been on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but my students and associates have also applied the approach to a number of other arenas of ethno-national conflict, including Cyprus, Northern Ireland, Sri Lanka, Colombia, and South Africa. Thank you. The central distinction in our work following John Burton has been between settlement of conflict and resolution of conflict. In contrast to the negotiation of a political settlement, a process of conflict resolution goes beyond a realist view of national interests. It explores the causes of the conflict, particularly causes in the form of unmet or threatened needs of identity, security, recognition, autonomy, and justice. It seeks solutions responsive to the needs of both sides through active engagement in joint problem solving. Hence, agreements achieved through a process of genuine conflict resolution, unlike compromises achieved through a bargaining process brokered or imposed by third parties, they're likely to engender the two parties' long-term commitment to the outcome and to transform their relationship. We have argued that an agreement emerging from such a process of conflict resolution and the new relationship it promotes are conducive to stable peace, mutually enhancing cooperation and ultimate reconciliation. Thus, reconciliation in this view is a consequence of successful conflict resolution. It comes at the end of the process with time. The test of a good agreement and of the process that generates it is its conduciveness to ultimate reconciliation. This does not mean, and has never meant, in my view, that reconciliation comes into play only after an agreement has been reached. Reconciliation is, after all, a process as well as an outcome. As a process, it should ideally be set into motion from the beginning of a peace process and as an integral part of it. In this spirit, I've described the exchange of the letters of mutual recognition between the PLO and the State of Israel, which I've always regarded as the most important feature of the Oslo Accord, as a rudimentary process of reconciliation. In the same spirit, the problem-solving workshops between politically influential Israelis and Palestinians that my colleagues and I have organized for many years represent tentative steps toward reconciliation, insofar as participants are encouraged to listen to and try to appreciate each other's narrative and to engage in a process of negotiating identity. As the Oslo process began to falter, I concluded that its step-by-step approach was no longer feasible because of the decline in trust and partnership between the two sides, and that a new process was needed in which reconciliation would move to the fore. I would make that point even more strongly today with the total breakdown of the peace process. I'm not proposing reconciliation is a precondition for negotiation, or it must precede a peace agreement, but significant steps toward reconciliation in the form of mutual acceptance of the other's nationhood and humanity are necessary in order to resume negotiations and move them forward. The process and outcome of negotiations must be consistent with the requirement for ultimate reconciliation. In my view, this requires negotiations committed to the search for a principled peace, anchored in a historic compromise. Although reconciliation has been vital to my thinking in these different ways, I tended to conceive it not so much as a separate process, but as a component and logical outcome of conflict resolution as my colleagues and I have conceptualized and practiced it. But the recent events that have increasingly focused the attention of social scientists and political actors on reconciliation have led me to view reconciliation as a distinct process, qualitatively different from conflict resolution, even conflict resolution within a needs-oriented, interactive problem-solving framework. Reconciliation is obviously continuous with and linked to conflict resolution, and it certainly is not an alternative to conflict resolution, but whereas conflict resolution refers to the process of achieving a mutually satisfactory and hence durable agreement between the two societies, reconciliation refers to the process whereby the societies learn to live together in the post-conflict environment. Combining the customary distinction between conflict settlement and resolution and the recent differentiation between conflict resolution and reconciliation suggests a conceptual model based on three qualitatively distinct processes of peacemaking: conflict settlement, conflict resolution, and reconciliation. Although settlement, resolution, and reconciliation represent three approaches to peacemaking, they should not be viewed as three different ways of achieving the same goal. Rather, there are three ways of achieving different, though often overlapping, goals, all broadly linked to changing the relationship between groups, communities, societies, or states from one of hostility to one of peaceful coexistence. The specific goals and emphases of the three processes may be congruent and mutually supportive, but they may also be contradictory to one another. I've already suggested that reconciliation is continuous with and linked to conflict resolution. In a sense, it can be argued that reconciliation, at least in its full form, presupposes conflict resolution, a long-term cooperative relationship based on mutual acceptance and respect is not likely to take hold without a peace agreement that addresses the fundamental needs and sense of justice of both sides. Similarly, it can be argued that conflict resolution presupposes conflict settlement, at least in the sense that a political agreement negotiated by the legitimate leaderships of the conflicting parties and endorsed by relevant outside powers and international organizations must be in place if the two societies are to consider their conflict to have ended in a fair and mutually satisfactory way. The three processes may thus be related in a sequential way, with settlement as the first step, which may or may not be followed by resolution, which in turn may or may not be followed by reconciliation. However, there is no reason to assume that the three processes necessarily follow such a sequence. Steps in the direction or in the spirit of settlement, resolution, or reconciliation may occur quite independently, in any order, and in any combination. In short, possible relationships between the three processes need to be explored conceptually and empirically, rather than assumed or dismissed. The main purpose of the present exercise is to see whether we can gain some analytical leverage by thinking of settlement, resolution, and reconciliation as qualitatively different, though not necessarily always empirically separate process, and identifying the distinct antecedent conditions and consequences of each. My special perspective on the distinction between conflict settlement, conflict resolution, and conflict and reconciliation derives from the proposition that they broadly correspond to the three processes of social influence: compliance, identification, and internalization, that I distinguished in my earlier work and that I believe some of you may be familiar with. Very briefly, for those who are not familiar with it, compliance refers to acceptance of influence from another in order to achieve a favorable reaction from the other, to gain a reward or approval from the other, or to avoid punishment or disapproval. Identification refers to acceptance of influence from the other in order to maintain a desired relationship to the other and the self-definition anchored in that relationship. Identification may involve taking on the role of the other or a role reciprocal to the role of the other. Internalization refers to acceptance of influence from another in order to maintain the congruence of one's own value system. Internalization may involve adopting new behavior because it is consistent with one's earlier beliefs or consonant with one's identity. I arrived at this three-way distinction early in my work on attitude and behavior change in individuals, out of an abiding interest in the quality of the changes induced by social influence, in the quality of the changes, the depth of change, the durability of change, the independence of change from the external source from which it was originally derived, the integration of the new elements into pre-existing structures, such as the person's belief system, value system, or personal identity. Each of the three processes of influence is characterized by a distinct set of antecedent conditions. For example, the source of the power of the influencing agent to induce change varies for the three processes. In the case of compliance, it is the agent's, what I call, means control, that is, the agent's control over rewards and punishment, material or psychological resources that are consequential to the person. In the case of identification, it is the agent's attractiveness, that is, the agent's desirability as a partner in a continuing relationship. In the case of internalization, it is the agent's credibility, that is, the agent's expertise and trustworthiness as a conveyor of value-relevant information. At the output end, each of the three processes is characterized by a distinct set of consequent conditions. Most important here are the conditions under which the new opinion or behavior is likely to manifest itself. The manifestation of compliance-based behavior depends on surveillance by the influencing agent. Identification-based behavior is not contingent on surveillance, but it does depend on the continuing salience of the person's relationship to the influencing agent. That is, it is likely to manifest itself only when the person acts within the role defined by that relationship. Finally, internalized behavior becomes independent of the original source and is likely to manifest itself whenever it is relevant to the issue at hand, regardless of the surveillance or salience of the influencing agent. I have extended this model of analysis to the relationship of individuals to the state or other social systems, and to the nation or other collective entities. In this connection, we have distinguished between three types of political orientation: rule orientation, role orientation, and value orientation, that are coordinated with the three processes of influence. The rule, role, and value distinction has also been useful in analyzing people's relationship to legitimate authority and their emotional reactions to their own deviations from social norms. I've also distinguished between rule-oriented, role-oriented, and value-oriented movements of social protest. In an entirely different context, in my writing on the ethics of social research, which has been mentioned by the introductions, I drew on my three-process model to distinguish among three types of ethical concerns that research may arouse. Concerns about the impact of the research on the interests of the individuals and communities who are the subjects of our investigations, on the quality of the relationship between investigators and research participants, and on broader societal values. I mention these various extensions of the original model because they suggest the possibility, or at least to me the hope, that they might also have some relevance to the analysis of conflict settlement, conflict resolution, and reconciliation as three distinct processes of peacemaking. My original model of social influence emerged out of research on persuasive communication, but it has broadened to capture the interaction of individuals or groups with each other and with larger social systems in a variety of social contexts, and their integration within these social systems. In essence, my trichotomy distinguishes three foci for these interactions. The first centers on individual and group interests, whose coordination is governed by a system of enforceable rules to which individuals are expected to comply. The second centers on the relationships between individuals or groups, which are managed through a system of shared roles with which individuals identify. The third centers on personal and group identities, expressing a value system that individuals internalize. As indicated, my original three-process model grew out of an interest in the quality of changes induced by social influence, their depth, durability, independence, and integration. My approach to conflict resolution has posed a very similar set of questions. What are the conditions under which negotiations to end the conflict will produce a high-quality agreement, an agreement that will be deeper, more durable, more sustainable, more fully integrated in the political cultures or societal belief systems of the conflicting societies than the settlements that are often hammered together under the pressure of external powers. I've always assumed, therefore, that it should be possible to forge a link between my work on conflict resolution and the three processes of influence. Now I feel I have found that link. This is, of course, aesthetically pleasing to me, but the important question is whether it is analytically useful. Does this link give us handles, at least metaphorically speaking, for distinguishing between qualitatively different ways of making peace, with distinct antecedents and consequent conditions? Specifically for present purposes, does the proposed correspondence of reconciliation to internalization suggest a useful way of defining and conceptualizing reconciliation? I'm not proposing an exact correspondence because we're dealing with different levels of analysis. In my original model of social influence, the unit of analysis is the individual. albeit the individual embedded in a social system. In a model of peacemaking, the unit of analysis is a pair of actors. The relationship between two parties, whether two individuals or two collectivities. My purpose here is to explore whether conceptualizing peacemaking processes in the terms of the broader trichotomy suggested by the three processes of compliance, identification, and internalization is useful in suggesting relevant hypotheses about the determinants and outcomes of different approaches to peacemaking. In this spirit, I propose that it may be useful to conceive of conflict settlement as operating primarily at the level of interests, conflict resolution at the level of relationships, and reconciliation at the level of identities. Let me first compare conflict settlement and resolution in terms of the distinction I have proposed. Conflict settlement can be described as a process yielding an agreement that meets the interests of both parties to the extent that their respective power positions enable them to prevail. In other words, the terms of their agreement are heavily determined by the power they can bring to bear in the negotiations. Third parties, outside powers or international organizations, often play a role in brokering or even imposing an agreement, using their own power by way of threats or inducements. The agreement may be supported by the publics on the two sides because they are tired of war and have found the status quo of continuing hostility and uncertainty increasingly intolerable. Such support of the agreement does not rest in any particular change in public attitudes toward the adversary. The settlement process is not designed to change the quality of the relationship between the societies. As is the case in compliance as a form of social influence, the stability of a political settlement ultimately depends on surveillance by the parties themselves, in keeping with their deterrent capacities, by outside powers, and by international organizations. Conflict settlement is not a negligible achievement in a violent and destructive relationship with escalatory potential. In fact, conflict resolution can often build on political settlements insofar as these involve a negotiating process in which each side pursues its interests and which are able to reach an agreement on many outstanding issues through distributive bargaining, in which power as well as international norms play a role. But conflict resolution, particularly if we think of it within an interactive problem-solving framework, goes beyond conflict settlement in many of the ways in which I have already alluded, It refers to an agreement that is arrived at interactively rather than imposed or sponsored by outside powers, and to which the parties therefore have a higher level of commitment. It addresses the parties' basic needs and fears, and therefore has a greater capacity to sustain itself over time. It builds a degree of working trust between the parties, a pragmatic trust in the other's interest in achieving and maintaining peace, and therefore is not entirely dependent on surveillance as the guarantor of the agreement. It establishes a new relationship between the parties, best described as a partnership, in which the parties are responsive to each other's needs and constraints and committed to reciprocity. It generates public support for the agreement and encourages the development of new images of the other. In all of these ways, conflict resolution moves beyond the interest-based settlement of the conflict and its dependence on the balance of power. It represents a strategic change in the relationship between the parties, expressed in terms of a pragmatic partnership in which each side is persuaded that stable peace and cooperation are both in its own interest and in the interest of the other. This is the kind of partnership that began to emerge between Israelis and Palestinians, especially at the leadership level in the early period after the 1993 Oslo Agreement. Conflict resolution, as described here, represents a transformation of the relationship between the parties. But there are limits to this new relationship which make it vulnerable to changes in interests, circumstances, and leadership. Conflict resolution as a process of peacemaking, like identification as a process of social influence, involves the development of a new relationship with an associated set of attitudes alongside or perhaps on top of the old attitudes. The new attitudes are not necessarily integrated with one's own pre-existing value structure and belief system, with one's old worldview. This means that the old attitudes, including attitudes of fundamental distrust and negation of the other, remain intact even as new attitudes toward the other associated with the new relationship take shape. The coexistence of such new attitudes, attitudes toward the other as a potential partner in peace, with old attitudes toward the other as a mortal enemy, creates instability in the new relationship, particularly in the context of an existential identity conflict. Changing circumstances may trigger the old attitudes in their full force. The third process, reconciliation, presupposes conflict resolution of the type that I've described, the development of working trust, the transformation of the relationship toward a partnership based on reciprocity and mutual responsiveness, an agreement that addresses both parties' basic needs. But it goes beyond conflict resolution in representing the change in each party's identity. The primary feature of the identity change constituting reconciliation is the removal of the negation of the other as a central component of one's own identity. My main empirical point of reference in this analysis is the Israeli-Palestinian case, in which mutual denial of the other's identity has been a central feature of the conflict over the decades. The mutual negation of the other's identity is perhaps not as central in other cases of conflict and reconciliation, such as those of Chile, Guatemala, or South Africa, or the German-Jewish, the Franco-German, or even the Egyptian-Israeli case. Yet in each case, the negation of the other is somehow embedded in the identity of each of the conflicting parties and must be addressed in the reconciliation process. Changing one's collective identity by removing the negation of the other from it implies a degree of acceptance of the other's identity, at least in the sense of acknowledging the validity and legitimacy of the other's narrative without necessarily agreeing with that narrative. The change in each party's identity may go further by moving toward the development of a common transcendent identity, not in lieu of, but alongside of each group's particularistic identity. Development of a transcendent identity becomes possible with reconciliation, and in turn reinforces reconciliation, but is not a necessary condition or consequence of reconciliation. What is essential to reconciliation, in my view, is that each party revise its own identity just enough to accommodate the identity of the other. As the parties overcome the negative interdependence of their identities, they can build on the positive interdependence of their identities that often characterizes parties living in close proximity to each other, which I've argued is the case with Israelis and Palestinians. Reconciliation, as I've defined it, goes beyond conflict resolution in that it moves past the level of pragmatic partnership, which is the hallmark of identification and essential to peacemaking, and enables the parties to internalize the new relationship, integrating it into their new identities. New attitudes toward the other can thus develop, not just alongside of the old identities, but of the old attitudes, but in place of the old attitudes, in contrast to the attitude change process that characterizes identification. Internalized attitudes are not just taken over in full measure, but they are reworked. As the new attitudes become integrated into the group's own identity, they gradually replace the old identity, the old attitudes. Working trust can gradually turn into personal trust. This does not foreclose the possibility that old fears and suspicion will reemerge, but the relationship is less vulnerable to situational changes. Viewing reconciliation as identity change linked to the process of internalization has important consequences, important implications for the nature of the identity change that it involves. Internalization represents a readiness to change an attitude because the new attitude, though induced by influence from an external source, is more consistent with the person's own pre-existing value system. Thus, the change in a particular attitude actually strengthens the pre-existing structure in which it is embedded by responding to a potential challenge to that structure. One might say, in the case of internalization, that we change in order to remain the same. By the same token, the change in each party's identity, the revision in its narrative that I'm defining as reconciliation, implies a strengthening rather than a weakening of each party's core identity. I would argue that a revision in the group's identity and the associated narrative is possible only if the core of the identity remains intact. In fact, changes in more peripheral elements of identity are often seen as necessary in order to preserve the core of the identity, just as changes in specific attitudes may be seen as necessary in order to maintain the consistency and integrity of a person's value framework. This was the basis, for example, on which a majority of Israelis and Palestinians were, and I believe continue to be, prepared to revise the territorial dimension of their national identity in order to maintain the essence of that identity. This analysis points to a major dilemma of reconciliation. Reconciliation requires parties to change an element of their identity, the negation of the other, which is far from trivial for parties engaged in an existential identity conflict, while at the same time preserving, even strengthening, the core of their identity. This is more easily achieved in situations in which one of the parties has already rejected part of that identity, part of its identity, as was the case for many Germans in post-Nazi Germany and many whites in post-apartheid South Africa, of its identity. It is important to emphasize here that in conflicts such as that between Palestinians and Israelis, negation of the other is a central element of each party's own identity, which it cannot give up easily. Given the nature of the conflict, each party finds it necessary to deny the other's authenticity as a people, the other's links to the land, and the other's national rights, especially its right to national self-determination through the establishment of an independent state in the land both claim, because the other's claims to peoplehood and to rights in the land are seen as competitive to each party's own claims and rights. Moreover, negation of the other is also important to each party in a violent conflict as a protection against negative elements in its own identity. Insofar as the other can be demonized and dehumanized, it becomes easier for each party to minimize guilt feelings for acts of violence or oppression against the other, and to avoid seeing itself in the role of victimizer rather than only the role of victim. Thus, in protracted identity conflicts, negation of the other is not a peripheral, marginal element of each party's identity that can be easily discarded. My argument is merely that from an objective point of view, negating the identity of the other is not a necessary condition for preserving and indeed enhancing the core of one's own identity. However, for conflicting parties to arrive at a point where they can be free to relegate negation of the other to the periphery of their own identities and eventually discard it requires the hard work of reconciliation. What is central to that work is the growing assurance that the other is not a threat to one's own identity. In that process of assurance, the conditions for reconciliation play a vital role. Parties in a conflict in which both sides perceive themselves as victims are helped to deal with the dilemma of abandoning some elements of identity without threatening the core of their identity by the reciprocal, is aided by the reciprocal nature of reconciliation. Changing on the part of one group, changes on the part of one group make changes on the part of the other group more attainable. But this view suggests that the process of reconciliation requires a certain amount of what I'm calling negotiation of identity, including the negotiation of the conditions for reconciliation, which turn on such issues as truth, justice, and responsibility. It is my contention that reconciliation, especially in cases in which neither party is prepared to adopt the role of perpetrator, cannot be achieved on the basis of purely objective criteria of truth, justice, or responsibility, anchored in historical scholarship or international law, but requires some degree of mutual accommodation in the course of negotiating the conditions for reconciliation. Let me just, I don't have time to go into detail here about the conditions, what I have in mind when I talk about the conditions of reconciliation, but I just want to mention 5 conditions that can help groups in conflict arrive at the difficult point of revising their identity so as to accommodate the identity of the other. One might also think of what I'm calling here the conditions for reconciliation as indicators of reconciliation or steps in the process of reconciliation. They're both indicators of movement toward reconciliation and conditions for further movement in that direction. So let me just mention the first of these conditions is mutual acknowledgement of the other's nationhood and humanity. The second is development of a common moral basis for peace. In other words, moving beyond the peace anchored in entirely in pragmatic considerations, even though these are essential to any peacemaking process, to a peace based on moral considerations. I've talked about this as a principled peace based on a historic compromise. The third condition is confrontation with history, confronting history and coming to terms with the truth, which is an essential component of any reconciliation effort. But we have to recognize that the different narratives of different groups reflect different historical experiences, occasioned by the same set of facts and figures, and that therefore their experienced truths may in fact not be identical. So reconciliation, in my view, does not require writing a joint consensual history, at least not in the first instant. That's something to be left for time. But it does require admitting the other's truth into one's own narrative. The fourth condition is acknowledgement of responsibility. Acceptance by each side of responsibility for the wrong that it has done to the other and for the course of the conflict. And the fifth condition is establishment of patterns and institutional mechanisms of cooperation, promotion of functional relations through cooperative activities in the economic spheres and in such domains as public health, environmental protection, communication, education, science, culture, and tourism. None of these can in themselves lead to reconciliation in the absence of a mutually acceptable, mutually satisfactory political agreement, but they can increase openness to the search for political solutions, and they can play an important role in peace building in the wake of a political solution. In sum, all 5 of the conditions for reconciliations that I've identified are designed to facilitate change in the collective identities of the conflicting parties, with particular emphasis on removing the negation of the other as a key element of each group's own identity. Let me just conclude with a very brief to my conceptualization of conflict settlement, conflict resolution, and reconciliation as 3 distinct processes operating at the level of interests, relationships, and identities, respectively. This distinction suggests the 3 broad tasks that all social entities, individuals, groups, organizations, societies, collectivities, must perform as they negotiate their social environment and seek to balance the requirements of self-maintenance and social orders, namely protecting and promoting their interests, establishing and maintaining their relationships, and affirming and expressing their identities. I think this has used up my 45 minutes, and I'll stop here.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bueno, después de este brillantísimo ejercicio de intelección psicosocial o psicosociológica, pues queda abierto el debate o las preguntas que vosotros quieren hacer. Bueno, dejemos primero a la gente.
No, pero no te lo digo.
Vamos a ver, quería hacerle una pregunta de todas las cosas que se han dicho. Me gustaría saber, sobre la última parte, la reconciliación entre grupos en que ninguno de los 2 grupos o de los grupos se consideran perpetradores. ¿Hay algún caso que usted haya estudiado empíricamente en que eso se ha llevado a cabo, que ha habido una reconciliación entre grupos? Me gustaría que se extendiera un poquito más en ese tema. Muchas gracias.
Está esperando la traducción.
So, groups in which neither consider themselves perpetrators. Well, I mean, that's not the same, perhaps, as saying groups in which both consider themselves victims. That's different, right? Okay, because obviously the Israeli-Palestinian case is one in which both consider themselves victims, and you can look at other cases in these terms. You know, I mean, you very often have that. I mean, even the more powerful party. As a matter of fact, even Nazi Germany, Nazi propaganda described Germany as the victim. That was a very strong element of Nazi propaganda, and described Jews as among the major perpetrators. So a case in which both consider themselves victims, that's common. But one in which neither consider themselves the perpetrator, well, I don't know. I mean, you can say, I mean, in the Israeli-Palestinian case, for example, you can say that it's, at some level, neither consider themselves the perpetrators, because they both say, well, yes, we have committed some violence, but our violence was in defense. Our violence was defensive. Their violence was aggressive, but our violence was defensive. So in that sense, they do not consider themselves perpetrators. They consider themselves as, I mean, they don't deny the violence that they've committed, but they consider their own violence to have been not perpetration, but defensive. So that's quite common. I mean, I don't know if you can say that about South Africa. You know, I mean, it's the black violence was, of course, defensive. You know, was response to oppression, and the white violence was in defense of their culture and their rights, so on. So I don't know, but I can't really think of a case in which which neither side considers themselves as having engaged in violence.
I'm sorry. My question was precisely about Israel and Palestinian. This is a case.
Yeah.
I was wondering if there is another case,
Yes.
in which you have empirical data that some kind of reconciliation has been working. I'm sorry,
Yeah. I mean, nothing that I have studied, to be sure. I don't know. What about some of the Latin American cases that have had commissions of reconciliation and so on? I think. I mean, I think the language in all of these conflicts is, you know, there's a tendency to describe the self as defense, as the victims in a way, and so even though they do not and cannot deny violence, it is defensive violence. So in that sense, I think that's fairly common. Maybe I don't understand the whole.
Sí, se ha trabajado, siguiendo con lo que acaban de preguntar, se ha trabajado en ese sentido, en hacerlos reconocer a ambas partes que son los causantes y no las víctimas, es decir, que ellos reconozcan esa parte de culpabilidad como un elemento que ayude a resolver los conflictos. Entiendo que sí, ¿no? Pero un poco apoyando la pregunta que han hecho, de abrirles los ojos para que esos daños que se hacen los unos a los otros son cada uno responsables. Se ha hablado de la responsabilidad, lo ha hablado, pero que en los conflictos se trabaje en esa línea, más que en la línea de la víctima, sino ambas partes son los que perpetúan, ¿no?
I mean, for example, in our Israeli-Palestinian work, in some of our groups, you know, some problem-solving workshops, particularly one group that I had that met during the 1990s. I'm taking one example of a group that was working over a period of time to deal with the issue of Palestinian refugees and the right of return. And there was a very big issue for Palestinians. Was really the symbolic issue, quite apart from the practical issues. I mean, obviously, there are practical issues about what happens to the refugees, the possibility of returning to their homes, compensation, resettlement, etc. I mean, there are those practical issues that need to be dealt with. But for Palestinians, the symbolic issue, the right of return, to a very heavy extent, is a symbolic issue. It is a way of Israel acknowledging that whatever you call it, the expulsion of large numbers, or the expulsion or flight, or combination of the two, of large numbers of Palestinians at the time of the creation of Israel was wrong. And they want to get acknowledgement from Israelis. They want the right of return, even when they say, we understand, as many Palestinians, particularly Palestinians engaged in negotiation, have been saying for quite some time, actually, this is not new, that they do not expect a complete return, or even a large-scale return of refugees to their original homes that are now in Israel. Many of these homes don't exist. Some of the villages from which they came don't exist. They don't expect that, but what's important for them, what makes the right of return very important is the symbolic meaning of it. That's a way of saying, yes, a wrong has been done to us. Our people have been expelled, have been removed from their homes as in the course of the process of the creation of Israel. Well, in this group, the Israelis, the Israelis, members of their group, went halfway to accepting the Palestinian demands by saying that they are prepared to accept a share of the responsibility. They're not willing to accept total responsibility for the problem of the Palestinian refugees, but they're willing to accept their share of the responsibility. The reason they don't want to accept total responsibility is because the basis for the argument is that the refugee problem was created in the context of what the Israelis call the War of Independence, the 1948 war. And in and what happened in the 1948 war was that when Israel, after the UN proposed the establishment of two states and so on, Israel then declared its independence. And at the time of, in response to the Declaration of Independence, there first were guerrilla actions on the part of Palestinians living in Palestine, and then Arab troops from 4 neighboring countries came into Palestine. So that created the war. According to the Israelis, the war was created not just by the creation of Israel, but by the attack both of indigenous Palestinians and of the Arab armies on Israel after it had been declared. So they're saying, yes, we accept our share of the responsibility because we do recognize that the creation of Israel created the problem of the refugees, or helped to create the problem of refugees, but it's only a share of the responsibility. So you have a movement in that direction. Now, the Israelis didn't ask the Palestinians to accept to express guilt for their violence in that particular case. So I can't say that it was reciprocal. But that was one example in which you had at least had some movement in the direction of accepting responsibility, though not accepting guilt. Some Israelis, of course, have done that. You have a book by a psychologist, actually, called Born in Sin. Talking about the creation of Israel as a state that was born in sin because of what it did to the Palestinians. But by and large, the more centrist Israelis are not ready to accept guilt, although they are ready to accept an element of responsibility. And now this is an example of what I've given you of what I have in mind when I said that these conditions of reconciliation, one of which is accepting guilt, dealing with the issue of responsibility and guilt, are things that have to be negotiated. This has to become a process of negotiation. It's not something that can be imposed on the basis of some, external legal framework or what have you. At least that's my view.
My question is, I'm wondering whether it's possible to have meaningful reconciliation without justice. And what I have in mind is South Africa, I'm thinking about their truth and reconciliation attempt, which in my opinion was a complete failure. This is because it opened old wounds and it reminded South Africans of the horrific events during apartheid time. And what the government of South Africa did then was to offer amnesty to anybody who came up to narrate any horrific crimes that were committed during apartheid. And the question again is just that, is it possible to have any meaningful reconciliation without justice? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that's a very complicated part. Unfortunately, that's part of my talk that I that I left out, in which I had talked about different definitions of justice. I distinguished between substantive justice, future justice, procedural justice, and emotional justice. And my main point here, first, the broad answer to your question is certainly no. I don't think you can have reconciliation without justice. And I think that from my point of view, a necessary condition for reconciliation is an agreement, a peace agreement or whatever, a peace agreement that is perceived as fair and as consistent with the principles of attainable justice. This is a term that was proposed by Walid Khalidi. Some of you may have heard of him. He's one of the leading Palestinian analysts, Palestinian intellectuals, and he's talked about attainable justice, or sometimes he calls it pragmatic justice. In other words, justice, a justice that may not conform to what is your idea of what real justice requires, but that is shaped within the limits of what is achievable under the prevailing conditions. So that's why I'm saying that even justice is something that has to be negotiated. What kind of justice and what degree of justice will be acceptable, can be acceptable in order to get agreement between the parties. So it has to be negotiated, but the sense that the agreement is based on considerations of justice, even if it doesn't conform to all of the requirements of justice that one or the other party may pose, I think that is essential.
Sí, le quería hacer dos preguntas muy cortas. La primera, ¿qué opina del trabajo de las asociaciones de víctimas, organizaciones de víctimas israelíes y palestinas que trabajan por la reconciliación? Por ejemplo, The Parent Circle Families Forum, si lo conoce y qué opina de su trabajo. Y en segundo lugar, usted hablaba de la influencia política. ¿Cuáles son los factores de influencia política que están trabando, están obstaculizando que tanto israelíes como palestinos no se pongan de acuerdo y asuman de manera colectiva un proceso de reconciliación? ¿Cuáles serían las trabas fundamentales que usted ve tanto en Israel como en Palestina para que este proceso se pueda llevar a cabo? Gracias.
Well, the victim associations, like for example, the organization of parents, I think they're doing wonderful work. I've met some of the people, and I'm very impressed with them. I think they're doing wonderful work, and they are, I think, as far as I can see, they are avoiding getting into, comparative victimization. Which is what so often happens in conflict, and they're willing to accept the basic idea that the other side, that both sides are victims, whether one of them, whatever they feel, whether they feel that the violence on one side is more justified than the violence on the other, they start with the proposition that both of us have been victimized, and they empathize with the victimization of the other. And I think that goes a long way to reconciliation. And I think it is a way of trying to what shall I say, to avoid being bogged down by legally defined justice, and to really take it more at the more human experiential level. And I think this is I think their work is very, very important and very impressive. Now, your second question was about
the troubles or obstacles from both sides to reach reconciliations in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Well, can you open this for me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I think, thank you. If I have to mention any one thing, the most important problem, the most important barrier is the divisions on each side. That that within each side you have conflicts between the more doves and hawks, as the expression goes, between the pro-negotiation elements and anti-negotiation elements, and the trouble is that that under certain circumstances, and a lot of this is what happened after the Oslo Agreement, was that the anti-negotiation elements gain strength. I mean, what happens when you have like the Oslo Agreement, which was a partial agreement, and which set you on the course towards an agreement? Both the pro-negotiation elements and the anti-negotiation elements become strengthened as you're moving towards the goal. The trouble was that the anti-negotiation elements were more strengthened, and they gained greater influence. And you have in Israel, in fact, in the last elections, the electorate has gone to the right. There's been an increase of the right has become strengthened in Israeli politics, and on the Palestinian side, of course, there's been the division between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and Fatah, and that is that division is a major obstacle on the Palestinian side, and the strength of the right is a major obstacle on the Israeli side. So those I see as the major problems. We do have, what I would present as a positive element is that there has been, and looking at it from a long-term perspective, there's really been an enormous movement, a great deal of movement over the decades in this conflict. I mean, it may seem to people that we're back in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to where we were at the beginning. Well, in some respects that may be true, but it is not at all true. The fact is that, when I started my work, actively, I know. You mentioned my 1945 article. I was already concerned with the issue in 1945. I was 18 years old. But when I started my work on this, our first Israeli-Palestinian workshop was in 1971. Well, in those years, in the 70s, and actually even in a lot of the 80s, the idea of a two-state solution was unheard of. It was quite foreign. I mentioned Walid Khalidi, the Palestinian intellectual. He published an article in 1978, which he called, what was the word? I forgot the title of it.
It doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, but in which he talked about a two-state solution as an something that people don't consider within the realm of the possible. Now it has become something that majorities on both sides clearly support, with different degrees of enthusiasm, but they support the idea, and it's widely understood that that's the way to go, that the conflict can only be ended with the establishment of two states. So that's enormous progress. The problem is that while you have this acceptance of the basic terms of what a solution has to look like, there's a tremendous level of distrust in the other side. There's belief in each side that there is no partner for peace on the other side. And this is widely held among the publics, even among those elements that favor a two-state solution. In other words, their belief is, yes, this would be a good solution, but we don't believe that we have a partner for that solution. So that's what I consider to be the big problem at this point. It is reestablishing the trust in the availability of a partner on the other side. And in a way, in my own small, modest efforts are directed at that. I mean, that's really what we are pushing for, what we're working for, is to find ways of reestablishing trust in the availability of a negotiating partner.
I will speak in English. Thank you for your presence. It is truly a privilege to listen to your wisdom today. But my question is, as I'm trying to find a linkage between cognitive science and social psychology, I was wondering, what do you think is the role that the mass cognitive mentality can play in any of the three peacemaking processes?
I believe that, I mean, I don't know whether I would use the term mass cognitive psychology, but if I may use a term public opinion, is that close enough, or public sentiments or so on, public attitudes? I think they play a very important role, and as you move from settlement, my three processes, as you move from settlement to resolution to reconciliation, the public reactions, the public involvement, the public support for the peace process becomes more and more important. In other words, reconciliation, I think, is not possible unless you have public support for it. I mean, that is really what it is about. That is, I mean, you can have reconciliation, obviously, with certain sub-publics, but if a larger reconciliation process requires public support. So it requires a sense, development of a sense. Fundamentally, I mean, the first most important element is what I've mentioned before, the element of trust, trust in the other, and so on. So reconciliation definitely, clearly has no meaning unless there's a reconciliation between peoples. Conflict resolution also, involves public support, but perhaps it can be, you can have conflict resolution when you have major elements of the elites who are committed to the process. We had that to a certain extent in the aftermath of the Oslo Agreement. Now, conflict settlement does not require public support, although that's one of its weaknesses. That in the absence of public support, you have the peace is less stable, less durable, and less substantive, because it doesn't contribute to a change in the relationship between the conflicting societies.
Thank you.
And I might say that's particularly important when you're talking about peace between two communities that have to live with each other. You know, I mean, you can have a trade agreement between two countries without public support. That's irrelevant. But when you're talking about peace between two communities that live with each other, that have to live with each other, as is the case with Israelis and Palestinians, then you cannot have it without public support.
Thank you. But now, how can the public support be reached? What is the main influence, perhaps the political influence that the political elites have over their society? And this is where the cognitive science plays in, that the political influence uses a cognitive science strategy to lead, to guide the masses, the public support, into a certain direction. How can the public support be achieved effectively? What do you recommend to achieve that public support?
Well, I mean, for example, I think that a major contribution in achieving public support is to find ways of energizing the public. So let me give you, I mean, a good example is the initiative of President Sadat of Egypt. I don't know if you all know the history. In 1977, when Sadat declared that he would come, he made the trip to Jerusalem. It was at least. Thank you. See, I need this the fuel. It was a unilateral initiative, you might say. I mean, he went out and took the risk and did that initiative. We know as a fact that there have been some prior negotiations, but basically it was a unilateral step. But he took that step, really had an electrifying effect on the Israeli public. I mean, it so happened my wife and I were in Israel at the time that Sadat came, and we were going right on to Egypt. So we experienced the effect of Sadat's visit in both societies, from being present there. Well, the Sadat visit had an electrifying effect on the Israeli public because he did things that created a tremendous level of trust that nothing could have created. First of all, he took an action that was consequential. He took risks. He took great chances. In some respects, one may say he paid the price for it when he was assassinated. He wasn't assassinated just for that, but I'm sure that was one of the factors that helped to delegitimize him sufficiently within certain circles that made his assassination possible. So he went there and took the risk, and then he came. He went to the Knesset, the Israeli Parliament, and he gave a speech in which he said, "Yes, we rejected you." I mean, he confirmed the Israelis' part of the Israelis' narrative by saying, "Yes, we treated you, we rejected you, we excluded you, we treated you as enemies, and so on. But we're ready now to open our hands," and so on. So he did things. He said things that created a level of trust that was just unknown just a day before. They did public opinion polls in Israel shortly before his visit and shortly after his visit, and on the question of is peace with Arabs possible, there was about a 60% increase. I mean, something like that. I'm not sure the figure is right, but that level of change in public opinion is almost unheard of. But it was a dramatic a dramatic initiative of this kind. Now, I feel my own view on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that what is needed now, I mean, clearly if you could have an initiative from one side or the other, it would be great, but there don't seem to be any Sadats and even fewer Mandelas around. But I feel, what I would be pushing for is a joint declaration of principles from both leaderships, in which in which essentially they declare that I could write it. In fact, I have written it. I mean, just to indicate what I think what I think such a declaration would have to contain. But obviously, it has to come. It has to be created. I believe it has to be created jointly by the two parties together. But the kind of initiative, the kind of declaration that I'm thinking of would be one that begins with the proposition that the land about which a conflict, on which a conflict is focusing, is, I would put it very strongly. I would say the land belongs to both peoples. If they're not ready to put it that strongly, then what they could say is, this is a land to which both peoples are deeply attached and in which both peoples have authentic historical roots. The two parties, the two peoples have fought over it for a century, each trying to attain exclusive ownership over that land. All that has led to is continuing violence, repeated wars, and if it keeps going like this, they may end up destroying each other. So we have therefore decided that to put an end to that conflict, we accept the fact that the land belongs to both peoples and that they have to find a way of sharing it. We agree that the land would be shared by allowing each people to establish its own sovereign, independent state within the land that they both share and to which both are attached. Two states that will live in peace with each other. I have been using a slogan for that. It hasn't yet caught on, but maybe it will catch on. My slogan is the one country, two state solution. In other words, we are saying it is one country and each people is attached to the whole country. You know, they're not attached to just a part of the country that would be its state, but it accepts the fact that there will be two separate states within that country. But by accepting separate states, each in part of the country, we are still maintaining our attachment to the whole country. Under conditions of peace, that's possible. You know, under conditions of hostility, that's not possible because, you know, if a Palestinian poet writes about the beauties of Jaffa, which is, you know, in the heart of Israel, then it's considered to be dangerous to Israelis. But in my formula of the one country, two state solution, it would not be considered dangerous. Yes, of course. Why shouldn't he be attached to Jaffa? As long as he doesn't want to own Jaffa politically. And why shouldn't Jews be attached to Hebron, where after all, Abraham's tomb is in Hebron? That's where the Jewish religion was born. Why shouldn't Jews be attached to that part as long as they don't want to own it? So it's making the distinction between the country to which both are attached and the states which are established in only part of the country. Well, anyway, my feeling is if you could get some kind of declaration of this sort coming from both sides, I think that could energize the publics. That could overcome. See, the important thing is that what such a declaration does is that it acknowledges the identity of the other. It says, yes, we accept the fact that you have roots here. You are attached to this land, and you have a right to be attached to the land. And the other side acknowledges the same. So the reciprocity in this, the fact that each party is accepting, is acknowledging your identity creates the kind of trust that is now so terribly lacking in the conflict. So it's not easy to achieve.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bueno, pienso que ya estamos un poco en el límite. La directora tiene la pregunta. Comiendo. No. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? Te faltaba a ti, si puedes.
Sí, vale, voy a ser muy breve.
Muy breve.
Sí. Bueno, pues muchas gracias porque su conferencia genera un torrente de reflexiones, ¿no? Yo solamente quisiera hacer un comentario, ¿no? Porque muy a menudo se habla de identidades colectivas en conflicto. Por ejemplo, en el caso... perdón.
It's not being translated.
Ajá. ¿Sí?
Ahora.
Bueno, ahora, bien. Sí. Digo que se ha planteado el conflicto en términos, digamos, de relación problemática entre identidades. Yo no sé exactamente si podríamos restringir la problemática en el caso del conflicto palestino-israelí en estos términos, porque al fin y al cabo no hay una identidad palestina homogénea, al igual que no hay una identidad israelí homogénea. De hecho, hay israelíes que son árabes, ¿no? Y hay israelíes que no son ni judíos ni árabes también. Me parece que la situación es algo más compleja. Y en el caso de Palestina ocurre exactamente lo mismo, porque no podemos olvidar la estructura confesional muy compleja de la sociedad palestina. Por lo tanto, no hay una sola identidad palestina, hay varias identidades palestinas. Y hay otro aspecto que me parece especialmente importante, que es, por ejemplo, la identidad, una identidad laica. De hecho, me parece, hace poco tuve ocasión de leer en un magazine marroquí un artículo sobre los discursos de una activista israelí, que es la señora Nurit Peled El-Hanan, que es una activista pacifista, que además ha sufrido en sus propias carnes la desaparición de un hijo de 14 años que fue matado por un terrorista suicida palestino. Bueno, pues esta señora, contrariamente a lo que a lo mejor uno podría esperar, se ha implicado justamente en acciones pacifistas, cuestionando muy severamente las políticas de los sucesivos gobiernos israelíes. Por lo tanto, no hay unanimidad, ni en un campo ni en otro. Y a eso además se suma otro proceso, bien es verdad que un proceso también de etnicización, que eso es otro aspecto que me parece especialmente importante, porque no hay que olvidar que durante siglos judíos y árabes han convivido, coexistido. Hombre, lógicamente, a veces con reacciones más o menos felices que otras, pero desde luego han convivido. Es más, yo creo que comparten muchos elementos de sus respectivas culturas. Entonces, la cuestión, lógicamente, sería, no solamente preguntarse cuáles son los factores causales de este conflicto, sino cómo se ha ido transformando también este conflicto. Y ahí sí que me parece que hay estrategias, yo diría casi de monopolización o estrategias monopolísticas, tanto en un campo como en otro. Es decir, están los señores de la guerra, los grupos que encuentran intereses en perpetuar el conflicto. Dicho de otra manera, yo creo que, y ahí es donde reside la dificultad, es que la reconciliación, yo creo que no solamente pide la implicación de palestinos e israelíes, sino que exige también seguramente abordar la problemática del conflicto en el espacio nacional estatal. Hombre, en el caso de Israel, el caso de Palestina más problemático porque no hay Estado. Y seguramente hasta que no haya Estado difícilmente se va a arreglar la situación. Y a eso se suma otro factor distorsionador de la situación, que son los procesos de globalización. Porque claro, ahora ya no solamente estamos ante un conflicto palestino-israelí o un conflicto árabe-israelí, estamos ante un conflicto que se internacionaliza cada vez más. Dicho de otra manera, o realmente se ponen los esfuerzos suficientes para contribuir a buscar una solución al conflicto y lógicamente orquestar lo que sería una reconciliación, o bien nos estamos aproximando cada vez más a un abismo más profundo. Entonces, a ver lo que podría responder con respecto a este comentario que acabo de hacer. Muchas gracias.
I didn't understand enough of it to be able to comment.
Dice que no llegó a comprender muy bien.
Bueno, pues da igual, ya no comentaremos en la pregunta más breve. Quiero decir, lo que quiero decir es que no estamos ante un conflicto de dos categorías identitarias. Estamos en presencia de una selva de fabricación de identidades que muy a menudo está al servicio de intereses, yo diría, muy oscuros, tanto por parte israelí como por parte, palestina, y también de otros actores internacionales. Es decir, me parece que, es bastante más complejo. Sí, no, después.
What she's asking is that the polarization that it is in your model perhaps will need some complexization, some more complexization within each of the two bipolar agents or actors which are in conflict.
Inside Israel and
there is a complexity, there is more complexity that the concept of collective identity will mean for each of the conflicting parties. That's I think the essence. But is how. I think that I think that you have commented too much, and we can do it later on in the afternoon. So, bueno, muchas gracias por vuestra presencia aquí, muchas gracias por la fabulosa conferencia y tal.